today we are going to tackle a pretty big subject and talk about bail, because you didn't think you could get through an entire criminal justice course without discussing bail, right? We're going to start by talking ancient history. Then we're going to go through some misconceptions about bail, and then we're going to talk more about the history as we're progressing in our modern day. So most of us know that we have a system of bail. If you've ever watched even a single drama TV show, you've seen bail. Not correctly, but you'd be familiar enough with what bail is. Where did it come from? Well, at least dating back to the 11th century, we've had a system of bail. Just like a lot of the other legal systems and practices that we brought with us when we were English colonists, right? Royal English subjects in North America, bail is one of those. And it's a practice that we brought with us and we've kept. It has undergone a lot of changes, but it has its origination from way back before we were colonists, way back before we declared our independence. There have been some significant changes though. Around the time of the civil rights movements is when you really start to see a lot of big changes start to happen, and it's not done. Bail is still just a continual evolution of the way society feels, how laws are interpreted, and we will come back to the Constitution. So most laws, most criminal justice procedures, you can just go all the way back to the Constitution, right? Our highest governing document. And that's where you're going to start looking to kind of uncover the controversy, right? And there is a lot of controversy surrounding bail as a system. All right, so let's talk about what the controversy is, right? So there is a lot of controversy. What is the controversy? Well, a lot of it stems from the argument that the Eighth Amendment protects the right from excessive bail, right? So if you recall that our Constitution has several sections in it that provide protections to criminal defendants, right? Namely the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment provides a right against excessive bail. Note that it does not say that everyone is guaranteed bail, right? So it just can't be excessive. The controversy comes in at, well, what's excessive, right? And if you've ever read the Constitution of the United States, you will know that there's not a whole lot of clarification given, right? It just states what they believe was plain terms. It's not always so plain to us a couple hundred years later. It just states the rule or the law, right? The rule of law, it just states it, right? Excessive bail shall not be imposed. It's left to the Supreme Court and the inferior courts to interpret what that means and to figure out when bail would be excessive and when it isn't excessive. So that will be the topic of an entire separate section, maybe part of a constitutional law video. But for right now, we're just going to note what the controversy is. Those that feel that any bail, that bail at all, is against the Constitution because a bail fine of $1 could be excessive for someone that does not have $1. The same as, like, you could say the same for $100, $1,000. It doesn't matter the amount, right? So it doesn't matter how high, it doesn't matter how low if someone doesn't have it. So the argument is that bail in and of itself, just having bail, discriminates against minorities and the poor. So let's talk about, now that we know the controversy around and why we even care about bail and why we're going to address bail and discuss it. First, because it is a really hot political issue, but second, there's a lot of misconceptions about it, right? And we want to make sure that we're fully informed before we progress through our degree or progress through the field of criminal justice. If you're practicing or are hoping to practice, we don't want to take as fact the things that we see in drama TV or even in little snippets on the news. We want to be fully informed. So TV dramas. let's go over a common scenario that we see, and then we'll talk about why it's incorrect. Okay, so you have a couple people, they go out on the weekends to a dance club, they drink a little bit too much, they start to have an argument, they go outside, one keys the other person's car, one picks up a rock and starts throwing things. Okay, drama, it escalates, right? Police officers show up, they pick them both up, the group up, however many, a single person, whoever it is, take them to the local jail. And that's where the drama continues, right? They demand a phone call, they're banging on the cell walls, and I want to call an attorney, right? There is no mention of courts or proceedings or magistrates or consideration of constitutional rights. There's none of that, right? They make a phone call, they call their mom or a significant other or a sibling, a best friend, someone they haven't spoken to in 5 years but they know lives close by, someone they know has the money. That person comes, posts bail for them, and then they're out, it's done and over, nothing is ever said about it ever again. Okay, so because it's coming from drama TV and because we're talking about it, you can pretty much assume that is not going to be the correct way, right? There's just nothing particularly exciting about the correct way, so I can see why TV does it, but we want to be educated, right? So let's get into trying to reset all of that and let's learn a little bit more about the correct procedures. We have made a lot of progress. As I mentioned, one of the ways that really wasn't working was to have defendants that couldn't afford to pay a cash bail. So they would go, and a lot of times there would be these independent bond companies that would fight for retail space near the courthouses, as defendants weren't able to go far, if they could go anywhere at all, to try to find help covering their bail. These individual private companies would sell bonds, right? Bail bonds, which would be a way that a defendant could pay a fee in order to have the whole bond covered. What would happen is that the agents that work for the private companies would essentially work to assure that the defendant actually showed up to court. If the defendant did not, they were called a bail jumper, sometimes a bond jumper, and the bond agency or an agent of the bond was able to, and this varies by state, to essentially go and retrieve the defendant that has skipped. Right, so there's a lot of movies about this, so I don't think this will be a new concept, right? That system it wasn't really working. So what do we have now? So we have started to move away from that. However, if you watch a lot of present day documentaries, or if you listen to people giving their opinion about the bail system, a lot of what they'll talk about, they're more referring to the older way of doing it, which is having the bail bonds, because bail was relatively high and a lot of defendants just couldn't pay it. They had to use a bondsman. The more modern laws have been moving away from that system and surprisingly moving away from a defendant needing a cash bond at all. So we're actually going to talk about a really cool piece of legislation, and it's called the Bail Reform Act of 1984. That act, which we'll get into in subsequent videos, really does some really cool things that, again, is kind of progressing the way that we do things that's more fair to defendants, right? We don't want to, as a system, intentionally violate anyone's constitutional rights or require someone that is poor, they can't afford a cash bond or a cash bail, to sit in jail for any period of time that they don't have to be just because they're poor. Right? Or maybe they're stubborn and they just don't want to pay, right? For whatever reason, they're not making the payment. Using private bond companies has an entire set of flaws all on its own. First, the agents are often allowed to carry weapons if permitted by state. They're often permitted to trespass, to break and enter, to essentially kidnap, to retrieve a defendant against their will, to transport them, right? All the classic elements of criminal kidnapping. they're allowed to do a lot of things that law enforcement isn't allowed to do. They don't have to worry about necessarily evidence or due process or other rights and protections that we afford to criminal defendants. Because it's a private company and they're not held to the standard of what we hold government agents to be, right? So most of the Constitution applies to government agents, right? It limits the power of the government, so it really comes into play when you have a government agent. The problem is that these private bail companies they're not government agents, right? It's a private for-profit company. So not right or wrong, it's just our history, and that's where we've been. So where are we going? Well, we have a really cool piece of legislation that we are going to look at that is called the Bail Reform Act of 1984, and it introduces a whole lot of things that are trying to get us from where we were, requiring substantial sums of cash bond, to using bond agencies, to now trying to get away from exchanging cash or requiring any kind of bond essentially at all. So in the next video, we are going to begin looking at the Bail Reform Act of 1984.